Today's episode features the amazing Jessica Minhas. You'll hear me calling her Jess throughout the episode, and since we're all friends at this point, I'm excited to introduce you to my friend Jess. So, Jess is a human rights and mental health advocate. She's a journalist, a public speaker, and the founder and CEO of I'll Go First. Now, I'll Go First is something we talk about in this episode, but let me give you just a quick rundown. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding and supporting mental health and trauma recovery care in underserved and vulnerable communities around the world. They use storytelling and mobile technology to do just that. This pursuit is born from passion. Everything that Jess does is colored by a commitment to shed light on issues normally silenced in shame, and she works to offer hope to those without it. As I mentioned, we dive so much more into I'll Go First and the work that Jess is doing, her work around sex trafficking, her work around normalizing conversations about trauma, around bringing mental health to a more accessible, tangible place for each and every one of us. So in this episode, you'll hear us in the beginning, Jess and I, talking about our racial identities and how as kids, it was something that was so confusing and ambiguous for us. And Jess actually talks about the fact that she grew up for most of her life thinking that she was indeed white until she started learning more about who her biological parents were and where she came from and where they came from and the whole story of her family. Her story is one with so many different aspects that just make her the incredible human being that she is today. We talk a lot about therapy. If you've listened to any other episodes, you know I'm a big fan of talking about therapy as much as possible because I do believe it can help each and every one of us. We talk a lot about the experience of finding the path to being worthy of love and understanding, really. At the end of the day, you're always worthy of love. But that process of understanding secure attachment and codependency and the process of reparenting. If you're in therapy, you've heard these words. If you're not, I encourage you to look them up after you hear a little bit about what we talk about. We talk a lot about alcoholism. Both Jess and I have some significant experiences in our lives where alcoholism has shaped those around us and therefore have shaped our paths. And if you are somebody that has alcoholism in your life, has impacted you or addiction of any kind, I think that there's a lot of aspects of what we talk about that might ring true for you as well. We talk about abuse and a lot of that abuse coming out of this addictive environment that's around us. We talk about grief and loss, both grief and loss in the physical sense of losing those that are close to us, but also Jess shares her experience with chronic illness and how there's some grief and loss that goes along with that new normal that comes about as you're navigating life with a chronic illness. And then finally, one of my favorite pieces of this conversation is when Jess talks about the incredible power of her sharing her story and feeling as though she shouldn't take up time and space to tell the world about her life or tell the world about her vulnerability or about the one thing that she was trying not to say out loud, and the power of understanding that actually sharing her story can save someone's life. So I hope after this episode, you are encouraged to live more expansively, to share your story more broadly, and really, really, really understand that you are put here on this earth for a reason. So with all that, I am so excited for you to learn more about Jess, her book that's coming up, and also her app that you'll hear about towards the end. That's really, something that is just, I think, going to change the game for a lot of trauma survivors. So I'll catch you on the other side of this episode. Hi, Jess. Welcome to Checkbox Other.
Hi.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here today.
Oh my gosh, we're both so happy.
So happy. And I know I'll probably do this in the introduction a little bit too, but I just want to give a quick, a little bit of fangirl love to how we met each other. So for the audience, we met each other at Marie Forleo's book launch event. You've heard me talk about Marie a lot lately with all the things that have been going on.
Famous on the website. I watched your video.
Oh, thank you. It kind of came out of nowhere, I will tell you. I mean, I did the B school years and years and years ago, and have just been kind of in the background for so long. And all of a sudden it was this was the year that Marie was coming back into my life and her world. And then I got to meet you. So I'm beyond grateful. So Jess and I met by the bar before it was in a big event space, and they had a bar in kind of the entry lobby. And it was just one of those environments where everyone was so excited to meet each other. It was just all good vibes everywhere. And I turned around and ran into you guys. I was like, hi, I'm Nikki. How are you? And it's one of those things. It was like a meet cute of friends.
And my best friend Jen was there, and she has to
Oh,
be the most outgoing person. I know she can make anyone melt. And I was having like extreme social anxiety that day. So I was so grateful that she like was going ahead of me, making these amazing relationships.
well, I can tell you, the both of you, it felt like such a wonderful soft landing. It was that day I was running around like crazy. And so to be able to kind of have that moment of like actual connection with two people, even if it was in, 45 seconds, was wonderful. And to be talking to you now, it just is a testament to the power of 45 seconds, really,
Yeah, and Marie's community. I mean, I think the women are so supportive. This is like
It's
the opposite of high school lunchroom.
right. High school would be a completely different place if it was, God, everyone would feel so good about themselves if
Oh
that's
my
what high school
God.
was like, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So the first question I ask people usually is to take me through a little bit of like a recap, a Cliff Notes version of your journey that has led you to who you are today and what you're putting out in the world. I know it's really easy, like 2 sentences. No, take as long as you want to kind of walk through some of
I
it.
think the lunchroom is a really great place to start
Oh,
because,
good.
yeah, because I was like the only brown girl in the lunchroom
Me
and in
too.
the South with a
Oh,
lot of white people. And it's just only recently, my husband is really passionate about social justice, and his family has a ton of wonderful sisters and brothers who have been adopted. And then his family runs like a children's village in Zambia. And so it's like a massive, it's almost like a foster care place. There's
yeah.
120 kids. And so the family's like very in tune with adoption and like social justice around racial injustice and stuff. And it's only after we got married that he was like, you know, that you're not white. And I was like, oh. So now I'm like going through this come to Jesus moment where I'm like, oh, like white people. Because all this time I was like, I'm white. And he's like,
Right.
no, boo, you're not. You're not white. And so when I think back about that high school lunchroom, I'm like, oh, that's why they were saying that. It's because I'm not white.
Oh,
Yeah, like kids used to call me Minjin, and I thought that was so cute for a long time.
Yeah.
Because they were like, you know, like Indians, and they're like Indian people. I was like, okay, yeah, and they're like,
Cool.
and your last name is Minhas, so Minjin. I was like, that's so cute. And now Chris is like, no, that's pretty racist. Like Injin is like a name that you call
Right.
a derogatory name.
Yeah. It wasn't from a place of love. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I grew up in Florida for the most part. I was raised in a military family, but my parents were not able to, or they gave up their desire to raise their children. My identical twin sister and I. So my grandparents, who were white, took over like our guardianship,
Hmm.
and then my identical twin sister was killed in this horrible, totally preventable accident, and then my grandmother drank herself to death, and it was just my grandfather and I. So that is like kind
Wow.
of the very short version of it. I was with my very white, very racist grandfather, and this whole time I didn't realize like everything he was
Mm,
calling me is because he was giving me clues. Like,
yeah.
and I spent the last like after age 18, I spent the last like, oh my gosh, just a long time. No, I'm like 18 years because I'm 36. So
Yeah.
half my lifetime searching for my biological family, which included my mother and father, who did not want to be found. I found them anyway.
Oh, wow. Investigative journalism in your own life. I mean, that's
Oh my
pretty
gosh.
incredible.
If there's injustice, I will find you.
Well, I feel like that is, I mean, did you just give the title for this episode just then? I mean, that was perfect. I mean, there's so many pieces to our journeys when we're younger that we don't understand the gravity of them until we're older and able to look back and actually able to question them from a more kind of fully formed perspective. And that experience of hearing you talk about, like, I just grew up thinking I was white. I've I've been wrestling with that my whole life, and knowing that I'm, my father is a Haitian immigrant, and I was one of the darkest people around. And I knew, like intellectually knew I wasn't white, but I grew up in spaces that were majority white. And I mean, in a culture that is white supremacist in its own way. And so the whole idea that whiteness is normal and whiteness is baseline and default, really, right? So there is a part of like really coming to terms with the fact that if you are able to pass, or you have learned to survive by passing in some way, it is this weird feeling of, wait, I'm an adult and I'm discovering this part of myself that's been here the whole time that I wasn't even aware of, or allowing myself to be aware of, or I was
I
sheltered
think
in
the
some way.
permission is a really good way to say it. I have like taken a long time to say
Yeah.
like, oh, I have the permission to say that I'm not white, because I related so much to why me. I thought I was white until,
Yeah. Yeah.
until actually just recently, where I found out the family secret that my grandparents lied to me, and they actually trafficked my mother from Morocco. So now I'm half Middle Eastern, Jewish, and half Indian. So like it's been layers
Oh
of
my
like
goodness.
non-whiteness. Because
Right.
before I was like, oh, I'm just half.
Right.
Now I'm like, oh no, I'm fully,
Right.
fully. Did you? I'm so excited that there's foundation my color now. I feel like
Oh,
that's been a while.
I mean, of all the things, right? I mean, so the next question I ask people is about the times that they feel other. And I feel like in this, we started with your high school cafeteria. Now let's go to like CVS. I don't know if you had CVS, but like, let's go to like the CVS/pharmacy aisle of makeup and hair product and all that. Like, that's a moment in my life where I always was like looking around being like, am I supposed to mix these things? Am I supposed to just make my face look a completely different color than I am to be made up? Like, it is such a weird thing.
That's such a good way to say, because when you say mix, I even think about filling out. Like I recently found my college forms, and it's under race. It's only had like black, white, or Asian, and I filled in white. But
Mm,
sometimes I would fill in like white and black just at the same time, because
yeah.
I don't know. Do we mix them?
Right. Or like it says choose one and you're like, I always felt like, am I supposed to choose my mom or my dad? Like, this doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't work. And
So
even
your
you,
mom is white.
yes, she is. Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating is right. I think, the interesting part too is, we've been having a lot of conversations, my mother and I, about just racial dynamics in America and racial dynamics in my childhood and the stuff that I experienced and felt and weathered and, made it through and figured out ways to kind of laugh things off that probably weren't very laughable. Um, and she said, I never thought of you as Black. I've never thought of you as anything. She's like, but I've really also never thought of you as white. And I said, we've had this conversation. I'm like, but by not thinking of me at all in that, there is a part where you defaulted to white and it left that room for ambiguity. And I did the same thing. My family, my mother and my father were divorced when I was pretty young too. So we didn't really have conversations about that. So I feel like there is this part of youth trying to find their identity. But if there's not even a place to talk about it or acknowledge that identity exists, how are you supposed to kind of figure that out?
Yeah, I didn't meet Indian people until I moved to New York City. Have you found this when you try and relate to the Black community, that you're like not accepted, or are they pretty accepting? And like,
Mm,
what is it with dating?
okay, so I'm so happy you're asking me this question now because if you talked to me a couple years ago, I would have had a different answer. And I learned that a lot of my hesitation was in my brain and in my kind of fear of not being accepted. Um, my experience in actually putting myself in situations where I have the opportunity to be rejected. Uh, I've never had, I mean, when I was younger, how about this? I'll go backwards. When I was younger, back to the lunchroom, I was actually asked in sixth grade. I remember the woman well, she's a woman now, the girl that came up to me and said, are you going to sit with us? Are you going to sit with them? And it was the white
Wow.
kids or the Black kids and Hispanic kids, but it was when all of our elementary schools came together. So I had spent most of my elementary school years with white folks And also, you know, they had kind of a busing system of sorts where people from Hartford would be coming into our schools. And I was close with at least one of the girls. It's so funny. My dad actually ran into her mom at a supermarket the other day and told me, but it was such an interesting experience of having to choose. And so I think there's a part of it that like, I felt because I said, no, I don't want to choose. Like, you're my friends and can we all sit together? In saying no to distancing and separating myself, I felt like that was the choice at, 10 or 11 years old, that I was no longer allowed to participate in the community of color that I rejected by being like, wait, I don't want to have to choose. And I carried that 11-year-old thinking into my 30s. And then I was like, you know what? Screw that. And I started really being intentional about being in spaces where it wasn't necessarily about your skin color, but it was about the depth of conversation you were having around race. Because I think that there's a part of this that you can find when we go from like, well, I'm with all white people, so I want to be with all Black people. It doesn't actually achieve what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to find a place where belonging exists. So,
such a good way to say it. Belonging.
Yeah. So it's been a journey. How about you? How's that experience been for you? Of really kind of finding groups and the communities that you can have these conversations in.
I mean, I feel like the experience that I had when I came to New York to meet Indian people, the Indian community, even now I'm still trying to figure it out. Like I just learned this term desi. I didn't even know that was a thing. But it's a really big thing. And I always, maybe to your point, I feel awkward. Maybe I'm bringing that awkwardness into the group. Because I'm just like trying to ask questions. But there's Indian community, they're so good about staying in touch. They have a very tight knit way that they build relationships. And so I think it's been hard for me, but I think you might have a point. Like maybe I'm bringing that awkwardness into it. But I did meet, so the old school Indians that come from India, they're very closed off and they have very patriarchal experience. I don't know, that's the way you say it. But I found the family in the UK, and there's like 60 cousins, and they're all like our age or a little bit older, and they were awesome. Like they've married, different races, and it hasn't been a thing, and they were like very accepting, and it was no problem.
Are you saying 60 of your cousins? Is that what you were just saying? 60 cousins?
Yes, girl. Yes, girl.
Wow. And you're so discovering 60 new 60 new family members that can be, oh my God, that's amazing. I'm like, I grew up as an only child for like the first 11 years of my life. And I'm like, oh my God, if that were like, right? Give me the influx of all of this wonderful familial dynamic. That's beautiful. Wow. Okay. So I'll ask this just in case there's any other kind of stories you want to share, but are there any like specific moments in your life where you really like remember not feeling like you belong? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I dated this one guy when I was 16, and he was white, and I was totally like, oh my God, he's amazing. He was like my first kiss. And so we went to visit his family in Louisiana, and his parents were divorced. We were with his mom, and he had a like terrible relationship with his dad. So he and his mom were like super, super close. We had dinner with them the night, like dinner with her and her partner the night before, and I was like, man, I did awesome. Like I win parents over. This is fantastic. And the next morning he was like super quiet, and then we were over breakfast, and I was like, is something wrong? Like you feel kind of distant. And he was like, well, my mom's like, she doesn't like you. And I was like, why? I'm awesome. And he was like, well, you're not like us. And I was like, what do you mean? And he, like, I'm not Louisianian. Like, what is the problem? And he was like, like, we're not the same. Like, you're not white. And that was like what?
I'm not what? Yeah.
And then even then I was like, no, you're wrong. No.
Yeah.
I think that definitely was the moment. I think trying to build relationships with Indian people, I got called like Happy for a long time.
Yeah.
That was really difficult trying to, figure out race and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny because I guess funny is not the word, but it's what I'm using right now. Um, we are young and we're learning those moments of like sticking your neck out there and like showing up and meeting the parents and putting yourself out and being like, cool, this seems great. I feel like I belong here. And to have that experience, I mean, my first like big crush, he didn't tell me to my face, I don't believe. I mean, I remember the party that I was told that he couldn't date me because I was Black.
Stop.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure he didn't have the courage, we'll say, to say it to me. And it's crazy because he ended up dating one of my very, very good friends. Um, and it was such a weird experience because there was the part of me, right? If you're growing up in a white space, you're getting this messaging that white is best. So there was a part of me that was like, I mean, I can understand that your family would say that, but I don't believe that in my body. And I'm no different because of that.
Yeah, I was in love with this guy who was Black, and when I met his mom, she was like, "You're gonna have to really show up when you meet other Black women." And I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "You need to have your nails done, you need to have your outfit, like your hair needs to be perfect, like you need to come into the room very commanding." And I was like, "I don't understand." She's like, "They will tear you apart." And one time, like we were in a grocery line, and my partner at the time was in front of me, and he was checking out, and I was kind of standing close to him, and it was an African American girl who was on the checkout, and she looked at me, and she looked at him, and she was like, "Is she bothering you?" And he was like, kind of chuckled awkwardly, and he was like, "No, that's my girlfriend." And she was like, put off by it, really, really put off by it.
Yeah.
So that was like really confusing as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I talk to a lot of people about the experience, if you're a child of a mixed race relationship, right? Or your parents, I shouldn't even say relationship because sometimes that's not, it does. Anyway, end of the day is if you are someone who one of your parents was white and one of your parents is Black, it's always such an interesting conversation because a lot of this identity I've found is in our society as a woman specifically. Maybe I shouldn't even go that far. That it's interesting to know how that shakes out if your mom is white or your mom is Black. I've found myself realizing that because so much of my identity has been in learning and in conversation with my mom, that I didn't learn about so much of the things I was having a hard time with, I thought were just me because my mom didn't have difficulty with figuring out her hair or figuring out the curves of her body or figuring out how to be in spaces where, people looked at you, whether you came in with a big entrance or not, because you looked different. With people making comments about you and your body, with people kind of uh, thinking of you as inferior in certain ways. And so I had my poor mother. I mean, my mother would say there was no lack of emotional conversation in my childhood, but I think there was a lot of kind of the identity stuff because we kind of blocked that portion out of conversation that I didn't really even understand was part of the dynamic of what was going on. I just thought there was something wrong with me as Nikki the whole time. So
really internalized it.
yeah. And, thank goodness. I mean, I'm so grateful for the time and the space that I've had to kind of dive back into that with my kind of adult perspective on things. And with just the world we're in now, where there is so much more information and conversation and experience sharing happening that you realize, oh my God, I wasn't alone. But there is a dynamic when you have the voices you have. I mean, you're talking about your grandfather being such a big voice in your life. I think sometimes we forget to give credit to the conditioning that we get, whether it's good, bad, or otherwise, but the messages that we're getting from the people that hold power in our lives as the way we see the world, instead of just assuming that's who we are,
No, that's
so,
such an interesting point you bring up about internalizing it and not having it be about the larger conversation. I'm learning a lot. I'm like gonna
yeah.
need to sit with these thoughts it, because that is such a good point.
Well, and it's one of those things too. And you've mentioned, about like kind of that experience of existing and getting kind of blindsided by these moments of being told, no, you don't belong here. And I don't think, we've talked a lot about kind of racial dynamics and kind of the visual aspects of your identity. But I think people have those experiences in so many parts of their lives. I had a guest recently that was talking about being told that she wasn't smart. She couldn't do, I think it was math, and being told she couldn't do that. And she was like, wait, what? I can't? And being told that like, just because of the way you think or read or process, or the way I remember playing basketball, the way I shot the basketball wasn't the exact way, but it in the net. I mean, it would be fine, but because it wasn't perfectly done the way other people did it, it made me different and wrong, needing fixing. Not going to say that like Steph Curry shouldn't be teaching me how to shoot a basketball better, but that experience of being like, oh, cool, I know how to play basketball. The point of basketball is to bounce it and shoot it, and goes, okay, cool. To realize, oh, I'm not doing it the right way, so I should stop doing it all, because now I'm not a basketball player because of it, is the piece of a lot of this, where when we're younger, we get those messages in such a blindsided way that we're like, I'm wrong, I should stop, I should go away. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my friend Anna Lynn McCord, she's a dear friend of mine. We've done a lot of human rights stuff together, and she has high trauma too. And so we relate on that trauma level. And she and I were talking about a friend of hers who right now she's working through feeling worthy of love. And I'm kind of like working through that as well, and trying to get that, like, I know it in my head, but trying to like really live it out. And he said to me, who gives you the permission to feel worthy of love? Who's in charge of that? And she was like, well, I mean, all these people said this stuff. And he was like, no, there's no such thing as being worthy of love. You're the one who either accepts it or not. You're the one who's telling yourself you're either worthy or you're not. And I was like, what?
You're like, hold on, let's go back. Say that again. Hold on. You just shook my entire world.
Crazy. I was like, I'm responsible. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's so funny. Before I literally like 20 minutes before we got on this conversation, this call, I had decided, because we are right now most people are saying like kind of day 5 of our social distancing. So we're early, but people are still realizing, okay, we're going to be in this for a bit. And I have kind of sworn off, I'm single. I have sworn off of dating apps because I feel like it has been so, it's so detached and kind of dehumanized in a certain way. It's become meat market swiping, and you don't really have any kind of substantive conversation. And I have been watching a lot of dating shows because I find them fascinating, like The Social Experiment.
They are fascinating.
Right?
Like Love is Blind.
Oh, so I'm glad you said this. So Love is Blind, I feel like, was a big part of it for me, because I realized just now that like, okay, we're in this state of quarantine, so there is no like casual dynamics are just not going to fly. Like, we have to have this space of isolation of conversation just inherently in what we're experiencing right now. I was like, I think I would dip back into this world, because there are now new boundaries and there are now new ways of approaching how we interact with each other, that it is more of an actual intellectual connection that you have to create, because physically you can't be around each other, because you're trusting on those 5 photos and the conversation you're having to carry a lot of your connection. And so it's so funny, because I was like, this sounds great, whatever. I sent something out on social media being like, is anybody else who's single trying this again or doing it for the first time to like see how it goes? Because I actually think the landscape's going to be completely different. But the funniest part is, this is 20 minutes before we hopped on, I was talking to my cousin who was in the Station Twins episode. And I was saying to her, like, I want to come at this with a completely different perspective this time. And the whole baseline, you just said it in like a sentence about being worthy of love, was part of what my pull was. I didn't put it in such like an eloquent fashion. It was about trust, and it was about boundaries, and it was about like being really clear about expectations and not playing games. But really at the end of it was just trusting that your worth and your worthiness is there. but there's so much that, when you've grown up a certain way, that you don't necessarily believe that about yourself.
Yeah, I'm working through this in therapy,
Yeah,
and
same.
it's been frustrating because there's so much messaging about, like, you just got to believe it. You got to change the way you think. You're not like having enough faith in it. There's the religious side, and then there's the self work. I mean, the self, like, oh my gosh, self help side. And then there's all the meditation people that, like, each has value, but all the messaging is like, if you just believe it, you can
Mm-hmm.
overcome it. And it's been really, I'm so grateful, and it's been really humbling. The kind of therapy I'm working in now, because I've done a lot,
Yeah.
is body based therapy. And when I've been like, my community is telling me I should just believe it, and I can't understand why it's so frustrating. She's like, well, take a minute. Like, as a kid, you believed all that because you had to survive within that element. So part of believing that was navigating and modulating your experience so that you can maintain that connection with your caregiver. Now it's like you're not just overriding the mentality, you're trying to override the physical experience, that anxiety you feel and that frustration when you're like, why can't I just get this? It's actually
Yeah.
like you are not relearning, you're learning for the first time what that secure attachment looks like for yourself. So you're having to reparent yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you and I feel like we could just go forever. I'm going to pull back a little bit to make sure that the audience is with us on some of this stuff. So you just blew my mind again, first of all. When you're talking about attachment and you're talking about kind of reparenting and kind of the caregivers in your life that might not have been a healthy dynamic for you, can you talk a little bit about kind of what, because I know that so much of your experience in that realm and that area has led to the work you're doing. So how, do you mind giving just a little bit of a background of kind of what the state of life was with you and your grandfather, and then how that's led to this space of really finding healing from the trauma that was there and creating spaces where you're able to reparent yourself, but also create spaces for other people to find safer spaces to work through what's been going on?
My grandfather, I hear, was a very funny, caring, lovely man when he was younger. But then once my grandmother passed, I mean, and their dynamic became really volatile as well. So my grandmother is the daughter of a German general, and my grandfather was a U.S. GI during World War II. And my grandmother's family was starving; like Nazis had taken everything. And even though her dad was in the military, it's like hard because the people in the military had no choice. Like, if you didn't join the military, you were going to get killed. And so he was a prisoner of war almost the entire time that he was enlisted.
Oh,
So there was no rations, there was no help. And so she met my grandfather, and he had rations. So he was able to, like, feed her family, and that's how they kind of met. But that meant they collided into each other under the guise of PTSD, like extreme trauma. And
mm,
that played out as they got older. And when my identical twin sister died, I think their marriage just, like, imploded. Like, there was no more filter. And so my grandmother coped by drinking a lot, and my grandfather coped by drinking a lot. And then I think, like, as happens with families where there's addiction, alcoholism, when they were both drinking, there was, again, like, they just lit up the house. So their dynamic was really tricky, and the push pull that you were talking about earlier as a child, like, that was happening in my house, like, be on my side, be on their side. But then my grandmother, she just couldn't handle it, and eventually she died when I was 9 years old because her organs failed.
mhm.
And it was because of alcoholism. And I think my grandfather just kind of internally fell apart, even though they were so abusive to each other. But so he just coped with alcohol too. So I only met him, like, I saw him in the morning before he was drunk. But then by the time I got home from school, he had already started drinking. On the weekends, he was drinking.
Yeah.
So I never met that nice guy. Like,
Right.
once I was old enough to go to the bus station myself, there was no reason for him to get up in the morning. So it's frustrating now because when I meet people who knew him, they're like, "Oh, he was just the kindest man." I'm like, that was a totally different
Yeah.
person. know that guy. So the dynamic in our house was that when my grandmother died, her thing to me was like, now you're the lady of the house. So I kind of took on the cooking, cleaning role, but as um, the fallout of that was I was also the emotional, like, I don't know what the word is. Like
Outlet. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
the emotional outlet. I got like triangulated is what we call it in like the technical terms in psychology and trauma recovery into the relationship as like the partner. And so it was just like hella abusive. It was
Yeah.
crazy. And it was hard. And I wonder, maybe you can empathize with this in a different way, but success became success started to feel really bad because when I started accomplishing something, there was no place that it was like taken well. My grandfather would
Yeah.
be like, um, you think you're a big shot. So I think as an adult, I struggle with like success feels horrible if I achieve something well. And then when I was 15, he had a stroke and became half paralyzed. And the first thought I had was like, oh, good, now he can't beat me anymore because he couldn't
Mhm.
break down the door. He was never, I want to be clear, he was never sexually abusive. He was physically abusive and he was definitely emotionally abusive. And that messaging of like, you're not enough, you're XYZ, like all these derogatory terms was drilled into me like every single day. And then when I was 16, he refused any medical physical therapy to get better. So then he taught himself how to walk. He was so proud of himself. He really celebrated one day and then he fell down and broke his hip. And that was kind of like I'm sure again you have experienced this. We've seen loved ones or have friends who have loved ones who, when their elderly parents, something like a broken hip happens, then they just give up the
Yeah.
reason to live. So that's kind of what happened with him. He just became so ugly. And he survived until like a few weeks after my high school graduation, just after I turned 18. And then I had zero family left.
Yeah.
And I found a baby picture of my half sister that I kind of remember, but didn't really put together that she was related to me. And that sent me to New York to like search for her. And I went to India and that's how I found human rights. And that's kind of been the process now. But now that I'm kind of finding the rest of my family, I'm going through this like existential crisis where I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't know what to do. Now, this whole time I've been finding family and now I don't know what to do with my life.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing your story because I think there's so much generosity in allowing others to kind of witness how how you look back at something like that. Um, and I don't think I have a feeling you probably don't know this, but my stepfather growing up was an alcoholic, and so many aspects of that kind of cloud that you were talking about that you got to witness, but other people got the sunshine of your grandfather.
Way to say it.
Um, People talked about my stepdad was a very outgoing, loud, gregarious, very expressive human. Sucked the air out of the room. Was the center of attention at all times, and add alcohol to that mix. I mean, all that stuff just gets amplified and it gets nastier. Kind of. I mean, I hear when you're saying kind of that edge to it that other people don't necessarily see because the performative nature gets turned off when you get home. And that I feel like we're having our own version of a little bit of a therapy session right now. I should bring this to therapy next time because the success stuff, it's actually been a huge part of both with my coach and my therapist of understanding what it's okay to show what's happening in your world, that it's successful, that you're good at something, that you're allowed to take up space, that you're allowed to say that I'm good at something. Because so much of my growing up was when I did something really great, it either was a threat to his attention or it was claimed by him as me following in his footsteps and he gave me all the skills to do X, Y, and Z. Whereas I was sitting there saying I did this despite this experience in my life. So it's so interesting because there was no physical abuse necessarily in my world, but it was mental, emotional, verbal, like no other. And I'm a very kind of intuitive person. So, I mean, the way the air moves, I pay attention to. So it was all a barrage on the senses, no matter kind of what was going on. And I think a lot of times when we don't have the physical piece of it, or even the sexual piece, and then even when the sexual piece is there, it's like, how bad was it really, tends to be how this conversation goes for viability or really taking things seriously. But when you're able to give yourself the room and the space and the care and the self-love and the worthiness that your experiences mattered, and they did have an impact on the way you process the world and you move through the world, and the way that you're allowing yourself to open up to care and kindness and love and reciprocation, and even to celebrate and create spaces for success, like that's real. That's more real. I mean, I was saying this to in an episode with Dr. T where we actually talked about social justice, and um, he was talking about a couple that he witnessed, that they came in to talk about domestic abuse, and he was talking about how it was the male abuser and his wife, and they were having a very frank and honest conversation about how and why it happened and how it was so transformative to him. And something that lit up to me actually in the middle of the episode was, it's so interesting because in physical abuse, if you have a broken bone, you can watch your body heal that. Not to say that it means it didn't happen, none of that. But when you have this kind of unspoken and unseen piece of this, it's really difficult to at least have the fortification of watching some sort of natural healing happen. And so, I mean, again, I feel like I'm feeding into all the things you're doing in this world. I think that, mental health and the therapy work that we're doing that can actually show us what our physical bodies can show us, that there is a path to healing and you can actually witness the progress you can have from one thing to another, gives us that fortification that we might not otherwise have had.
Yeah, my therapist talks about it like, she's like, at the end of the day, look at the data. So I would just encourage you, Nikki, like the things that I'm doing is like looking at the data. You have a successful podcast, you're a coach, you're an entrepreneur. Like at the end of the day, if you question that, like these things are working,
Yeah.
even without all the badness. So that's what I'm trying to keep in mind. But honestly, like, how are you doing it? Because I'm like looking for suggestions too. I mean, that's the place where it sounds like we're in a really similar spot.
Yeah.
It is like definitely a struggle to shake down all the negative stuff. And
Yeah.
I do wish, like, if I had a metric, what could that look like? So, she says the data. And then one thing that we talk about in trauma recovery is your ability to socially connect.
Yeah.
Because on a brain level, like our brains are social brains. And for trauma, you become very either divided or you retreat into yourself or you become really elevated and you're very reactionary. So the ability to maintain homeostasis in relationships are little successes along the way. And then one of my other professors said that when we can appreciate beauty and when we can play, that's another metric of the process that we're healing. Because just on a neurological level, again, it means that our amygdala and our hippocampus have calmed enough down so that we can let ourselves release and not think about all that other stuff on the back burner. How are you doing it?
How am I doing it? I'm doing it very nimbly. I'm doing it with an attempt to keep the judgment at a minimum, the self-judgment at a minimum, because I've learned so much of who I have been in my life that has led to success has been by defining success in very finite, judgment focused terms, that I either passed or failed. I either was successful because I got this raise, this promotion, this thing, we finished this project in time. So it was very kind of achievement data oriented, but from a perspective that was so detached, and there was no emotional, it was really just productivity. And so what I've tried to do is to slow things down as much as possible and give myself a little bit of room. I think, especially right now with everything that's happening with COVID-19, it's like it sounded weird. Is it COVID-19? Yeah, right. It's so weird. I feel it's like COVID-9. No, that's not it. It's like we are having to slow down. Like we are forced to kind of disengage from our normal, what I like to call a hamster wheel of life, where we hop on, we wake up, we hop on, we're just going all day until we pass out, fall back asleep, if you can sleep at all, because insomnia and your brain's still going. And we're in this spot now where like it's been disrupted. Your wheel's kind of broken a little bit. And you either have the choice to find a new wheel that can run you ragged, or look around and say, oh my God, there's something outside of this wheel. And I have to look at myself in this space and give yourself kind of that time, the space, and the grace and the compassion, which it's so funny. If you talked to me like a year and a half ago, I I was in a session with, it was my coach and then my therapist. They both hit it at the same time. So there must be external factors of how I'm talking about things that they were both like, this is a perfect time for this. But I was like, compassion is bullshit. Like there was a time that I was like, compassion, I am amazing at compassion for everyone around me, but self-compassion, what is that? Is that a pill I can take? Because I can't figure that out myself. And it really was the ability to slow things down and pay attention to my body. Like you mentioned body before, that your body has so many more clues than I've ever given my body credit for. As I've gotten older, I don't know if I've talked about this in the podcast, but I've detached from my body. I was an athlete very, very young. And when I was 21, I stopped playing soccer. But that was my identity. Like that was like another language for me. And it was a language that I had with my dad. And it was like so much of our relationship when I was younger was going to his soccer games and watching him coach. And so much of my experience with a huge parental figure in my life, but just with my own identity and my own strength was with my body. But when that went away, I started detaching, and I talk about it like it kind of moved from my feet all the way up to the only thing that was operating was my head. Because then I started operating in workspaces where I had to cover my body because I have curves, and I had to be really thoughtful that I didn't take up too much space. And I was in spaces that were set up for men's bodies and temperatures that were set up for men's bodies and like all of these things that I don't think physically I gave it credit, because I was like, whatever, I'll figure out how to survive it, because I've learned how to survive so many things. And I've lived in this survival hamster wheel of like, if I just keep going, it'll be fine. And okay, this challenge comes, I'll be resilient. I'll learn from it. I'll move over here, but like, I'm not going to slow down and say what's actually happening. I just need to keep moving. And so the actual choice to stop moving, slow down, stop and look around is scary. But it has been the best gift I could give myself in learning more about who I am and what I really need outside of how I've learned to survive. Because there's a part of that has told me this is what you need in order to make it to the next day. But when you slow down, you actually can witness, I am actually making it to the next day. Okay. I don't need to do that. So that's my kind of qualitative data that happens in that, of actually witnessing that, doing new things and changing your patterns, or even just stopping. And this is kind of meditative, right? Of witnessing your life and being a lot more observant, allows you so much more leeway to make more purposeful, value-based, and intentional choices. Oh, my goodness.
So well put.
Well, okay. So I want to hear a little bit. Well, not a little bit. I want to hear about,
digest all this afterward.
I know. I'll send you the all the audio before we even go live. No. So you've mentioned a couple of times your sister, and on this podcast, we've talked a lot about grief and loss and how that can be something that is a really difficult experience to, I use the word survive. I mean, to make it through. And I know I sent over to you a little thing about Harry Potter. I don't know. Are you a Harry Potter person?
For some reason, I have refused to watch Harry Potter because everyone else has. It's like a weird, I don't understand it myself.
Okay. So good. So I'm glad.
It, yeah.
Okay. So Harry Potter is something I didn't know at all. And I had this conversation with Janine Quo in a previous episode, and she mentioned this like beautiful experience. And I was like,
oh, and Brene Brown mentioned Harry Potter and something else of hers. And I was like, okay, two people that I really think are really great telling me these lessons that I need to learn through. Okay, I'll watch Harry Potter. And so there was like the Sci-Fi Channel or something had a whole marathon and I watched all of them. But that's side note. But one of the things that happens that Janine brought up in there that was like just so beautiful to me when she had expressed it was Harry Potter loses someone in this journey, and he comes back to school and he sees this creature that he had never seen before. And when Janine mentioned it, it was these creatures that were pulling these carts that looked like they were just moving by themselves. But he turned to another woman, her name was Luna, or I guess she was a child at the time because they're in school together, and says, they start talking about the fact that only the two of them can actually see this creature. And she turns to him and says, the only way you can see this is if you've lost someone. And so this is a long-winded way of talking about kind of how grief and loss have kind of shaped or taught you something or given you a perspective on the world that might have been different otherwise, or that those around you haven't experienced that you found may not see that same horse or that same kind of lesson in the world.
Yeah, I wonder if you can relate to this because you bring it up and I can just see the emotion on your face. That I feel in my experience that my grandparents were effectively my parents, and then my sister, she died really young. But I was just watching. Oh my gosh, what is The Hunters?
Oh, I haven't watched
Wait,
that yet.
oh my god, it's so good. But wait, it wasn't The Hunters. I forget the name of it, but it was this show on Netflix where they have stacks,
Okay.
and you become like you can change out your stack, which is like the digital version of yourself, and put it into a new sleeve, which is a person.
What?
I guess something like that. But I was just realizing, oh, you can make multiples of these stacks. So it was like, oh my gosh, my identical twin sister is the exact DNA replica of me. So I feel like grief changes over time and you have new insights and whatnot. But what I was getting to with us is that maybe I can speak the language of the oppressed. And I think maybe people who haven't experienced grief yet, they don't have the capacity to sit with people. It makes them feel very uncomfortable. They want to like leave, or they have the urge to calm that person, maybe touch that person, offer them a tissue or something because they can't withstand the environment and the uncomfortableness and the grief and the sadness that comes with losing somebody, and the various ways we lose people. Something horrible happens to them. It's a long, slow passing. There's so many ways that you can lose somebody in the physical sense, and then even the emotional sense when we lose a parent or when a relationship disintegrates. You have a friendship breakup. Those I think are even harder because then they're alive but they're dead.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That is so true. It's so funny because, I'm sure you've experienced this when you're sharing stuff about yourself, when you say you lost somebody in the physical sense and people kind of interrupt you and say, sorry, I'm so sorry. And you're like, I wasn't, okay, thank you. And then there's a piece of that feels like, oh, okay, this conversation should be over here. Or like it disrupts the ability to process it out loud. And so I don't, I shouldn't say always, but there's a lot of times when people say something like, I lost this person, and I try to give them room to say whatever they want to say next, because so often it's so much more than just those words of what happened and what's going on and how you're processing grief. And everybody processes it differently. There is no timeline. And I always feel like there's no real start or finish to it. But the gift, I guess, of being able to let grief breathe for other people in the way that they need it to breathe is something that I don't know that I've actually been able to kind of wrap my head around fully. Because I think we all feel a little bit uncomfortable because it's the unspoken stuff. We're taught to say, thoughts and prayers. We're taught to say, I'm so sorry for your loss, but we're not really, there's not that much modeling of how you sit in grief with someone or how you support somebody that's going through something that's really difficult. that might cause you to project a whole bunch of other experiences because of it, but how you own that own part of yourself and still allow that person to go through it and allow yourself the same. Because I feel like a lot of times when I talk about one of my really close guy friends from college passed away last year. And one of the things that's been such a really interesting experience is he was 33 years old. And so many of our friends are still around, and all of us are handling this completely differently. And there isn't really any kind of playbook, right? He passed away from cancer. He had cancer for a little while. No matter what, there was no one thing that you could say, but I feel better because of this. You're never going to necessarily feel better. And also, my friend who's right next to me that might be presenting similarly to the way I am and how we're processing this, we're both processing it in our own unique way. And to give the generosity, I feel like, to give the space and the understanding that it's okay to process however you want to is huge.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you just said about the generosity and of giving the gift of grief to breathe.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm like, can we breathe? Can we do a breathing meditation right now? Yeah.
So great. I love how you're saying that, and everyone processes it differently. Just that old moniker, let people feel their feelings.
Yeah. And also let yourself. I think that's part of grief, whatever you're doing, whatever you're working through in life, the fact that we have this judgment that we should have bereavement leave is what just came into my mind, where you're supposed to have 3 days allotted. And so you get 3 days and you're good now, right? In the same way of processing anything, to put a finite timeline on it and judge yourself that you haven't gotten there. Only makes it harder.
Yeah, it's so true. I realized this, and you had mentioned this in your email that you sent me, just about the idea of chronic illness. And I think that really relates a lot to grief. You grieve in the former life that you had.
Yeah.
But one thing I realized in the journey is that there's no overachieving when it comes to getting better. And I think that as I'm thinking about it, there's no overachieving when it comes to grief. And I'll speak for myself as someone who's type A, because I use that overachieving to feel love and self-worthy. But the other conversation we had earlier,
Yeah.
that was really humbling to kind of try and wrap my mind around.
So, okay, do you mind talking a little bit about chronic illness? How that's how that's shown up in your life, and what that journey's been like?
I think the hardest part about chronic illness for me has been identity, because in the same time that I found out that I had this chronic illness, I found out that my grandparents were related to me, and that they had been hiding this family secret, that they had obtained my mother from Morocco under very dubious terms, and the irony, of course, working in anti-human trafficking and my mother being technically trafficked for the purposes of adoption. That all came at the same time, along with the race thing and finding out chronic illness, and then trying to figure out what do we do next moving forward. That feels really awkward. What do I do with my career? What's my capacity and my capability to be able to do the things that I was doing? It's probably been the challenging part in the outward facing career part, and then the insecurity of how consistent and reliable am I going to be with whatever I do forward. And even in friendships, for the last 2 years when I was really sick, people will be like, oh, remember that time that we went to this place, and remember that time that we did this thing? I have literally no memory of it. And I think there's been a lot of grieving of that time. And I remember thinking with my husband, he was talking about some trip that we took and I couldn't remember it. And I thought, oh man, how hard it must be to be alone in our memories.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you're talking about, because chronic illness can manifest itself in a whole bunch of different parts of your life and parts of your body in impacts. And, it's so interesting as you're talking about the memories pieces of it. My family and I have been navigating Alzheimer's and dementia, which I think, what we're learning is there's a lot of brain related issues that have been have been happening all along for people.
I have a brain disease. So that,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's along those lines. Cognitive functioning has been really off. So, like, yes,
Yeah.
dementia and Alzheimer's. That was originally written on my medical records that I had early onset Alzheimer's and early onset dementia. I freaked out, of course, but later I found out it's because my doctors couldn't get the testing that they needed without listing that on my records. But I can empathize with that frustration of it being so ambiguous.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so you guys have been navigating that for a little while.
Yeah, but there is a part of this that even hearing, we haven't heard experiences of people's lives around brain injury in the way that we hear about people's lives around even like MS or, there's definitely, I don't know. I'm trying to think of things that used to be like, we don't talk about, but now we talk about a lot more. I think, one of the things that's been so beautiful, a friend of mine, her sibling had, anyway, it doesn't matter. A friend of mine's sister had her daughter, and her daughter was born with Down syndrome. And there was, way back, when we were kids / before that, like that was something you didn't talk about. And even more so now, there's another woman that I know who did I'll put this link in the show notes because I thought she was incredible, did a whole interview series with Vox about kind of the whole testing that you do when you're pregnant and making a decision one way or another. But just the fact that we're having conversations about people's lives that are different than the norm now that we didn't have before. And I think this conversation around cognitive ability one way or another and how these things have been happening and we've been throwing them away as, especially with the older generation, it's, they're old and senile. It's like, no, something's actually happening. Things are happening. And when there are brain injuries, and there's especially traumatic brain injuries, it's kind of like, oh yeah, something happened, but we don't actually get the understanding of what's happening in our brains to understand what and how we can operate with one another, even if there are things happening that are outside of our control.
Yeah, it's such a good point, especially with older family members who have dementia and Alzheimer's. I think what you said just now about like, we just throw it away, like there's nothing can it must be really hard to watch that process.
But and I think, it's about in the same way of when you would ask, like, how are you working through it? I think, I don't know why today the word nimble is like my favorite word, but I think being open to the fact that as things happen in our lives, we have to be willing to pivot. Perfect example of is what we're living through right now on a larger global health scale. But like, you had mentioned kind of that grief of being alone in memories and shared memories, and how can, though we don't hear stories from other people necessarily about these experiences, how can we figure out how to still live fully in that? And in the same way of, if somebody loses the ability to use parts of their body, how can you concurrently allow yourself to grieve the loss of that functionality, but still find a way to kind of nimbly live your life to the fullest capacity that you've got and celebrate that and give yourself the ability to feel joy in the midst of all of these things. We don't have to feel one thing and one thing only all the time.
Yeah, one of my professors at Harvard Medical School, he said that I hate wait, but there's no way to say that without feeling like very.
Don't worry, we're good.
I don't
we're
know
good.
how to say that. Like, maybe this goes back to what we said earlier. But just like I don't know how to. Anyway, he said that when we talk with people, we should be all thinking of the way we can say, "How can we celebrate your surviving?"
I love that. Okay, and how have you thought about that?
I think it's been hard for me to accept these esoterical things. So again, for me, it comes back to the data.
That's good. Yeah.
So when I think about how we experience trauma and what we do in trauma, and how sometimes part of the healing process of trauma is not just healing with what happened, it's also trying to heal from our behavior in it, and how we tried to navigate how we acquiesced, how we like maybe just went along with it, how we modulated our behavior. And I think that is part of the celebrating. Wow, look, how amazing is it that you were able to survive that?
Yeah.
Or even what you talked about a little bit earlier, this capacity that we have to disassociate. I always thought that that was something that's really frustrating for myself. Why can't I stay present? And my current therapist, Zoe Landers, she says, wow, isn't it amazing that you can disassociate? The brain can disassociate to help you survive those elements. I think really, so for me, I think I'm just starting to try and really focus on honoring the way our body reacts to things,
Yeah.
and trying to offer our stories as like a gift to other people. And this may come back to race, actually, what they say about, you know, women in the workforce who are not white and trying to bring diversity, and you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
So when it comes to mental health, and this kind of goes to why I do I'll Go First. It's because you can't be what you can't see. So I think offering our stories as a gift to others to show, hey, this is how I survived. I'm willing to go first and put my vulnerability out on the line, because I know that that's what's helped usher me towards safety and usher me towards surviving. And I hope that it can offer you the same thing.
Isn't that beautiful, right? That's the whole idea of building community through shared experience of being human together. It might not be the exact same experience, but like we're all here on this planet trying to navigate it. And I'm going to share my story, and hopefully it can help you. And I'd love to hear yours. So hopefully you can help me, and we all learn things from each other, even if you could put us next to each other and there's nothing visually that looks the same aside from the fact that we're human beings. I have such a hard time sometimes about the whole visual piece, because it's like baseline. I mean, if you look for the things that we're like, it's a whole lot more of those. A whole lot more of those. Okay, so you mentioned I'll Go First. Tell us a little bit. I mean, that's the name of your podcast. It's the name of your company. Tell us a little bit about I'll Go First.
I'll Go First started because I was working in anti-human trafficking efforts, and I happened to be sitting next to Annalyn McCord, and we were in Cambodia. We had just come from a field visit, and I had gotten an email asking for me to come share my personal story. And I had never shared my personal story on stage before. I always only talked about human rights. I only talked about trafficking efforts, how you can find your purpose with a human rights cause, or whatever you're passionate about, how you can apply that to social justice. So when I got the email out loud, I was like, I don't want to do this. There's many other things I'd rather do. Let me talk about other people if they're surviving. I don't want to talk about mine. My story's not important enough. Not enough bad things happen to me. You start disqualifying your whole experience.
Yep.
I like checkbox other. Yes, like I will check off all the reasons why I shouldn't be in the room. And she looked at me and she was like, "Well, look who's still stuck in the brothel." And that can feel very like, offensive. But what she meant by that is like, I was physically out of my situation, but emotionally and mentally, I hadn't gotten there yet. And I hadn't done the work, and I hadn't committed to the mental health work and the healing of my story. And so I just, from my hip, was like, fine, I'll go first. And I like that overachiever. I was like, that competitiveness, like, I'll show you, which doesn't make sense. I'm like going to be competitive about healing. I don't know if it works. Hey, it works.
Some people do. Don't you worry. Yeah, you're not alone in that feeling. Yeah.
So I went and did the speech, and like, I think like 1,000 people showed up. It was like in the mid-afternoon, and I was really expecting that no one would be there. Was hoping no one would be there. All these people came, and all these people that I knew came, which was like my worst nightmare. And I was so nervous before I went on stage. The organizer was sitting next to me, and he was like, "So, what are you going to say?" And I started cry laughing. I was just like, I couldn't even think of what to say.
Yeah.
So on my way up to the stage, I was like, don't talk about suicidality. Don't talk about suicide ideation. Like, you should leave that off the table. when I got up on stage, literally that's all I talked about was my struggle with suicide ideation. I hadn't even come to terms with that with myself. And when I rapped and everyone started clapping, people started coming to the stage, totally had that vulnerability hangover that Brene Brown talks about, wanted to hide under a rock, and then felt really bad. Like, oh my gosh, I told my story. I'm so sorry I took up all this time. Like, I shouldn't have taken up all this space. I'm so sorry you had to listen to that. Like, I wasn't even making sense with what I was saying. And then eventually everybody cleared out of the room. There was this one guy standing there, and he was like wearing a nice top and like button down and nice slacks, and he was kind of like sweating and kind of like nervous, and he was our age, like late 20s. And I was walking out, he was like, Jessica, and in my head I was like, more people to talk about. You might have seen this, which again doesn't make sense. Of course they saw it. They were sitting in the audience the whole time. And he was like, my name is Watson, and I was sitting in the audience, and I wasn't planning on coming today. And I was like, well, thanks so much that you came. I want to leave now and hide and cry. And he was like, no, like, you don't understand. This morning I woke up and I had decided I was going to kill myself. And I had no idea that this whole speech would be about suicide. And I was so caught up that I like let out an awkward like, and then I was like, why are words coming out of my mouth? I was like, I had no idea that that's what this would be about either. I'm so glad that you came. And he was like, if you can do it, then I can do it. And, okay, that's going first. That's all go first.
Oh. Well, I mean, everybody is a Watson at some point in their life somehow, where they're feeling alone and they feel like they're the only person going through what they're going through in life and feeling like they don't know how to solve it. Whether it's, I should clarify, I'm not sure that everybody has suicidal ideation, but there are a lot of people that do. There are a lot of people that go through that experience. And there are a lot of people, we all feel alone, we all feel lost, we feel like there's nothing else I can do. And then there are times, and I think that that's the thing that I think we probably have the most difficulty identifying with, is that part, your role in that dynamic of understanding that literally just by living our lives, whether we're on stage sharing our stories or otherwise, that we are and have the opportunity to impact people on such significant levels just by existing. And allowing ourselves to exist, allowing yourself to continue to keep speaking, even though you were feeling like, I don't know, I just said I wasn't going to talk about this, and just releasing the need to stop talking, to be quiet, to get out of the way, let somebody else, whatever those messages. Because I mean, what you just said is on reel inside my head so often too. Of like, I am so sorry I burdened you with my existence. But to have somebody come back and say, because you chose to stand in that space, because you chose to do that thing, because I witnessed you having a conversation with this person, because I watched how, when something went really wrong in your life, how you handled it, I learned how to do it from you, or even more so, I learned that you can survive it when it's not great, that you can pick yourself up and try again, that we all do fall on our faces and fail, that life is hard, but like the beauty of life is that it's hard, and the difficulty of life is that it's hard.
Yeah.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Write down after my journal.
You should get somebody to transcribe the whole thing. Yeah. Well, okay. So I'll go first. So that's the name of your company, and your company. Well, I should say this. And you have a podcast called I'll Go First. And in I'll Go First, what are people sharing their stories through there? Is that?
Yeah, the whole premise is like, tell me about your surviving. And tell me about the grief. One thing that I learned with another professor, Dr. Dan Allender, who's amazing, by the way. He does amazing work when it comes to healing from sexual abuse. Sexual abuse and domestic violence. I'll give you the links so you can include them.
Yeah.
He is like beautiful in the way he approaches everything. And he really focuses again on beauty. And he says, you know, when we think about sexual abuse, tell me of the pain of your hair, tell me the pain of your face. And I think what this goes back to what we even talking about earlier, like tell me the grief that you have around identity and not fitting in. Like what does it look like when your body betrays you? And so that's kind of part of how we think through. So it's one part community. The podcast is really about going first and showing how other people will survive. And I think it really is trying to integrate, how do we talk about the bodily experience that we have when it comes to trauma and when it comes to healing.
And that it's okay. That it's okay to experience all those things. It's okay to not know what to do. It's okay.
Yeah.
That we're all on a spectrum of experience of how we do these things. And there's not one right way to do anything. Oh, well, I hope everybody's listening to this and has already gone and subscribed to I'll Go First, because I mean, we all need to listen to more of these stories. Come on. So, okay.
Let's talk about healing too in different ways. And I think to your point about everyone does it differently. Everyone heals differently.
Yeah.
One of my board directors, and I have to just give credit to all these people because I
love it.
They say.
Yeah.
Because they're like the experts in the room and they're just so gifted at what they do. But one of my board members, Dr. Robin Stern, she is at the Yale Center for Social Emotional Learning. She's been a psychoanalyst analyst for like 20 something years. She worked with people right after 9/11. That was her focus, was on resiliency. And now she's doing really cool stuff in gaslighting. I'll give you those links too. Like, really fascinating stuff. I was complaining to her about like my complex about like self achieving when it comes to healing. She was like, look, everybody goes up the mountain on a different path. And I was like, okay, whatever. I've heard that before. And she's like, but we see the same thing. We go around the pain, but we get a higher perspective as we go up. And so we've had some amazing, cool people come on talk about like hip hop healing.
Oh,
yeah, like this is all body based. I mean, scientifically based, like evidence based approaches to healing that are not the norm, which I really celebrate too, because I've always felt like outside of that gap that we talked about earlier, like these modalities don't necessarily work for me specifically, or work with the survivors I've worked with specifically. So that's been really neat too, that discovery process. There are paths for people when it comes to healing, but we might have to think outside the box. And again, here are people going first in their crafts and their giftings and their talent.
Well, I'm so freaking, I'm like, can I go do this right now? So, okay. And then you're developing mobile mental health app?
Yeah. I'm super excited about this because I come from the justice background too. You know, my work in anti-trafficking. I'm all about wanting to help people getting, you know, prosecutions. I think that's a really big goal when it comes, we're hearing that in the Me Too era as well.
Yeah.
But when we think about trauma, you know, and again, you mentioned this a little earlier about how we disassociate from our body. When we are trying to go through all of our care team and repeating our experiences applies to chronic illness too. When we're in overwhelm, we're not going to remember like our symptoms, and we're not going to remember like the triggers or the nightmares or whatever, because as we repeat that story, our brain is like, we got to start forgetting this. This is too overwhelming.
Yeah.
So this is called story, and to help people log their physical experience along with their mental experience. It's meant to help them start to see patterns, and it's meant to help them create an escrow so they can give that to their care team when they're feeling overwhelmed and they just don't have the words to describe their experience. So it's amazing to work for mental health applications. That's cool, and I'm really passionate about that. But what really gets me excited is providing this as a mechanism for people who are going up against their perpetrator in the court of law. Because as we keep telling our story, that inconsistency starts happening, and you got to keep that consistency when you're going to testify against someone who abused you. So that's what gets me really excited. I'm like, let's be about that justice.
Oh my goodness. Did you say the name of it? Did you say the name of the app before?
Yeah, it's called Story. So yeah, just Story. And we named it like that because this is really about helping you articulate your experience. And so we use a lot of really cool therapy modalities, evidence-based therapy modalities, rooted in storytelling. Storytelling has incredible benefits for your brain.
I love this. Oh, I'm like on the verge of tears this whole time. I'm trying to keep myself together. That That's incredible on so many levels of just even the process of having to retell your trauma. So yes, your brain is like, stop, I don't want to do that. But also just the experience for your body. You know, my therapist actually talks to me about, kind of on the flip side, but like saying things to yourself in the mirror and repeating them over and over again, because your brain actually believes that they're happening. So the more you're repeating them, the more you're kind of re-triggering yourself, and your body is thinking, oh God, this is happening again. And so to be able to capture that without having to re-traumatize and re-trigger yourself, even as your brain is trying to save you, just giving you the opportunity to really be witnessed and be seen and be heard, but not have to put yourself through that every single time too, is just such a gift.
And the person who's using is really in charge of all of that, you know, whether they're not. But for me, it was like the sanity. Trauma makes everything so chaotic.
Yeah.
It's really about helping you create a linear story.
It's beautiful. I mean,
it's about like making you feel like I'm not a crazy person.
Right.
This happened, and here's how it happened. So we're still in development, but I'll send you the sign up link, and we hope to have it released like officially to the public in fall.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm so excited. And then the last thing I want to talk about is your book. The book that you're in. I love when you wrote that, there was like I'm going to say my own. It was like hard oi in there. I feel like everybody that's writing books in the middle of the process feels some version of that. But let's take a moment to celebrate a little bit of it. What is your book about? You know, how has that been?
Oh gosh, you know, from the beginning, it was a really cool idea. Let's talk about how I healed from trauma. Let's talk about how I found my biological family and that helped me heal from trauma. And now it's like, oh, this is really hard. You mean being vulnerable as like an occupation, writing a book on vulnerability? Am I sure I want to do it?
Yeah, and then writing it down, having the words all in print, and then yeah.
I mean, so the process I'm going through is writing about finding my biological family and kind of working through the pain of being with my grandfather, and then finding that my family wasn't related to me, and kind of the fallout of that. But my hope really is that it again goes back to what we were saying earlier, is about going first for people so they can see that healing is possible.
I am. If you're
encouraging, I so appreciate.
I know, and I can't even get my words out. I'm glad you can feel it, because I'm so excited. I think honestly, like, I feel like the power of the written word is something that at times can be underestimated, and we definitely underestimate ourselves and in our ability and the pen we've got and how powerful that can be. But I feel like my own journey in the last few years of kind of self-education, that like in school, I was learning from a very specific set of books that were written from a very specific perspective. And I have been very intentional about trying to learn from people that might not have had the opportunity to be in front of me when I was younger and in these educational settings. And really, really finding the value of the written word and books that people have put out in the world that may or may not be getting a lot of coverage and press and, you know, the huge signing, but, you know, whatever kind of mainstream metrics of success or viability. But I'm finding myself being so incredibly impacted by people that are willing to tell their story, are willing to kind of push outside the bounds. Because again, them going first allows me the opportunity to think outside my own boundaries that I've set up myself and have been conditioned within. So all of these, I mean, I've been trying so hard to keep myself at like a relatively like calm level, because I am trying not to fangirl too hard on all the things you're doing, because I think you're going to change more lives than you probably even have. I can imagine. And I feel like my imagination just went crazy in all the things you were telling me. But I am just so grateful for you. I'm so grateful again for that 45-second dynamic in the at the book launch event, that we were able to interact with each other. And I'll say thank you. I feel like that's an insufficient thing to say, for one, being so willing to be generous with your story, and for two, to be in this conversation with me. And I'll say thank you on behalf of my audience too, for the fact that you've been so generous in sharing all the things that you've lived through, you're living through, and you're bringing to the world, and you will be bringing magic for all of us. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's like,
this is such a gift to me. Thank you. I feel so encouraged. So thank you so much.
Well, and I'm going to just say this. This is going to be such a weird ending, but we talked about the fact that Jess and I are going to hop on and do our own little like dinner date virtually because we need to keep being in connection with each other. And so that will not be recorded for you all. Sorry. But I encourage you to take this podcast episode and have conversations with the people in your life, because so much of what we talked about are things that when we don't say them out loud, we feel like we're the only one. But when we do say them out loud, my goodness, you'll be amazed at how common these experiences in life that have been intentionally made us feel isolated are actually not isolating. They're something that can connect you with other people. So Jess, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
So isn't Jess incredible? I told you. Her generosity in sharing her story was just next level. I am so grateful for you for joining us, especially in the midst of COVID-19 and all the upheaval and uncertainty that comes with it, to have joined us in such a formative and foundationally sturdy and strong and challenging conversation that I'm just so grateful to have had the opportunity to have with Jess and to have had with you and your ears and your attention. I do encourage you, if this was something that was of interest to you, to look more into the topics we talked about, to talk to someone that's close to you. And if you're thinking about maybe therapy and this was something that you're like, oh my God, all those things that they were talking about, I feel like are things I want to talk about, I really do encourage you. It's an incredible, incredible resource. Especially during COVID-19, you have the opportunity to do something called telehealth, where you can actually meet with a therapist over the phone or over video conferencing. So many health insurance companies that might not have covered it before have expanded their coverage to allow for that. So that's my plug for therapy. I plugged it however many times in this episode, but if you made it to the end, I'm hoping that this is something of interest to you. So we talked about so many incredible things. I hope if this is an episode that did ring true to you, I'd love to hear from you. So if you go over to our website, nikkyinnocent.com/podcast, there is an area for you to click the link called Join the Conversation and let us know what you thought. Or if you'd prefer to just drop a comment on Instagram or some other social media where you found us, definitely feel free to do that. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And the best thing that I love when people do is share it with your friends, with your coworkers, with your family members, with the people near you that you think might benefit from this episode or another episode of Checkbox Other. So until next time, my friends, I'm just so grateful for you to be here. And please know, if in this time you're not really sure where you belong, I can assure you that each and every episode and each and every time we show up here in the Checkbox Other living room, you belong here. I'll catch you on the next episode.